About 10 years or so ago, there was a movie that came out. Some of you may have seen it called Children of Men. If you haven't seen the film, you may perhaps have read the novel of the same title by author P.D. James, which came out in about 1990. And the story of the film and the novel as well is an interesting one. It takes place in the not too distant future, in a world where the human race has become sterile. That is, people are not able to have children anymore. Every different race and nation and tribe around the world is no longer to conceive and have children. And the story takes place at a point 18 years after the last child was born on planet Earth. And in that short space of time, human society has descended into absolute chaos. The world has become an awful place to live, where there is not absolute anarchy. There is, at best, a country that operates as a complete police state. And the reason that the world has disintegrated to such an extent in this story is that without children, there are no future generations to think about. And people stop planning or hoping for the future. And in the absence of this hope, and without the motivation to plan for a better future, people start to give in to the sort of worst aspects of their humanity. There's a well-known preacher in California, the pastor of a large megachurch named Rick Warren, and he has said quite famously that we can live for several weeks without food. We can live for several days without water. We can live for several seconds without air. But we cannot live without hope. Now, in truth, I think we can survive without hope. But without hope, we do not live a very pleasant or enjoyable existence. Now, as you've heard a couple of times already, this week in the congregational curriculum known as the Story, we're looking at the book of Ezra. Ezra is a book that tells a happy and joyous story of God's promise fulfilled, and therefore a great sense of renewed hope for God's people. The book of Ezra starts to tell the story of ancient Israel in the year 539 BC. Cyrus has just become the king, or rather the emperor of the Persian Empire, where many of the Jews have gone to live in exile. Some 50 years before that, Palestine had been overrun by the Babylonian Empire. And the Babylonians at that time took many of the leaders of the Jewish people into exile to live in different parts of the empire. This was a common military strategy in antiquity. You would deport potential leaders and influential people from a conquered nation so that they could not together plot a revolution. And so the Jewish people went to live in exile in Babylon, and then in the course of history, the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians. And so then the Persians were ruling that territory formerly known as the Babylonian Empire. And in the year 539, Cyrus became the emperor, and he decided to send the Jews home. And he said explicitly, the God of heaven, the God who's made all that there is, has called me to send the Jews home, that they might rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, and so that God will be worshipped as God always intended. What a remarkable thing for a foreign emperor to say about a conquered people. It's unexpected. Why would this happen? The book of Ezra tells us it is because God moved in the heart of King Cyrus. God was the reason that God's people began to enjoy a change and improvement in their fortunes. And this is what we find throughout the story of the Bible, that for everything that God's people are and have, God is the reason and the source and the life-giving energy. God is the one who made the world and created humankind in the very image of God. It is God who called Abraham to get up and leave the land of his ancestors and go to the new land that God showed him. It was God who led the Hebrew people out of their slavery in Egypt. It is God who led them through the wilderness, and God who brought them to the promised land, and God who set David on the throne, and God who allowed the nation of Israel to prosper. And now it is God who is sending them home. God who intends to regather and reform the people of God, that God might live in their midst. For God is the source of all that they are and all that they have. Over the past year or so ago, the governing board of our church, which is known as the official board, has spent quite a bit of time reflecting on who it is we are as a church and what it is God is calling us to do and to be. And moreover, how God wants us to carry out our mission and to express ourselves to the community around us. After much discussion and all kinds of deliberations and prayer, we as a board came up not only with a way of expressing this thought verbally, but also visually. And you can see some of the results of that printed on the front cover of our bulletin. And the very first and most important part of how we have wanted to identify who we are and what our purpose is to say that we are centered with God. Just like ancient Israel, God is the source of all that we are and all that we have. It is God who created the world we live in. It is God who has created this beautiful land on the shore of Lake Simcoe in Simcoe County. It is God who gathered our forebears here to worship in this neighborhood some 180 years ago. It is God who has sustained the life of this congregation throughout this time. It is a God who enabled those who came before us to put up this beautiful building and to provide a space for us to meet. It is God who gathers us today. It is God who has sent us so many of the wonderful and gifted people who make up our congregation. It is God who has blessed us with all these beautiful children who are at the front of the church this morning. It is God who promises to be with us on into the future. When King Cyrus decided to end the captivity of those Jews who were within his territory, he decided to send them home. And it is important to note that they had a home. There was a particular place that was theirs. It was Jerusalem and the land that surrounded it. Now, I think it is fair to say that ever since the time of antiquity, God's people have found it a mystery as to why Jerusalem would be so important. Why is it, we might ask, for it seems so strange that of all the universe, God would place such importance on this little hill in Palestine. And I'm not about to be able to bring this mystery to an end, but I would like to suggest that the reason behind God's logic, if you will, is to say that Jerusalem and Mount Zion becomes a symbol of God's concrete presence in the world. It is a way of communicating to us that God is not just present in some kind of general or abstract sense, but that God wishes to be with humankind in particular and concrete ways. We do not live in Jerusalem. We live in Barrie. Barrie is not Jerusalem. The world is not wrestling with the spiritual implications of what Barrie is. Barrie is not a flashpoint for geopolitical conflict and competing races or religions. But in a very important sense, Barrie is our Jerusalem. Barrie is the place that God has placed us. Barrie is the place that God chooses to dwell in our midst. God is not only here, but God with us is here. And so over the past year or so ago, as our leadership board has reflected on our identity and purpose as a congregation, we have thought it important to say not only that God is with us and that God gathers us, but that God is with us in this particular place. And God has called us to serve this particular place. And that is why in our visual representation it says that we are centered in Barrie. One of the things I can tell you for a fact about church life in the 21st century is that vibrant, thriving, growing churches have a passionate commitment to the communities they serve. Of all the churches in North America which perhaps worship in our style and sing hymns and listen to classical music and look like our church in some sense, probably the largest by far is a Presbyterian church in New York City called Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And if you visit the website of this church, you will see that it is splashed all over with phrases of love for New York City and a desire to serve God in that place and to make God's love known to the people of that city. Love and commitment to New York City is the driving force of their very purpose for being. And I think if we were to look all across North America and find churches that are thriving, we would find a similar commitment for the different communities where they are located. God has put us here, and it is a wonderful place to be. Let us give thanks to God for our city and vow to do our best to make God's love known in this place. I think it is fair to say that the story of the book of Ezra and the whole idea of God's people being sent home from exile would be rather a meaningless one if it did not involve real people who were about to experience a concrete change and improvement in their lives. On the one hand, there were those Jews living in exile who were now going to be allowed to return home. Even if they had been born in exile, perhaps they were going to look forward to going back to the land of their ancestors and perhaps even living on a family plot of land. For those who had stayed behind and who were still living in Jerusalem or its surrounding area, it was a chance to be reunited with long-lost friends and family. It was a chance to have their communities and societies rebuilt. God was not acting in general or abstract terms, but God was acting in ways to effect transformation and renewal for God's people. The third part of our image and representation that has come from the reflection of our church leadership is to say that our church is centered on you. That is to say, centered on people. We're to be focused with a passionate love on those people we are called to serve. And we're to be reminded that our mission as a church relies not only on those people we are called to serve, but on those people, that is us, who are called to do it. For it is you and I who are called to be God's hands and feet, to do what God would have us do. That is to say, what God would do. The Old Testament book of Ezra is probably not one we read that often. But to read it is to be renewed and filled with a sense of joy and hopefulness. It comes at the point in the history of ancient Israel when they are able to recognize and enjoy that a promise of God to them has come true. And they are overflowing with a sense of hopefulness for the future. They look forward with delight to what will be enjoyed by their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and so on, living in faithfulness to God and living in close relationship with God. There was someone who once said that the Christian church at any point in its history is but one generation from extinction. Now, we all know that is not likely to happen, but in theory, it is true. We do not need to despair at this thought, but rather be encouraged by the purpose to which God has called us. To think about our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in faith who may be born into this community, who may move here from elsewhere, but who will inherit our legacy and pass it on to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, so that God's work will continue in this place, and God's love will be made known. Thanks and praise be to God.